David Draycott was in trouble. He owed money, and those he owed it to were starting to run out of patience. He could feel it in the darkness as he pulled his black Mercedes into the driveway of his home in Woodlands Way in Sutton and Ashfield. It was 9:17 p.m. on the 7th of October 2002. He had just been to his estranged wife's home a short distance away and had received 2 phone calls while he was there, telling him to pay up or he would be in big trouble. He had asked his wife, Andrea, if she could help him with a banker's draft to help him settle the debt. She had never seen him so worried before. Mr. Draycott had borrowed £10,000 for some unpleasant characters for a cocaine deal, but had not been able to keep up with the repayments, and now the debt had escalated to more than £30,000, though he had told his wife that he needed the money to pay off the VAT bill on the sheet metal business that he was running. Drakey, a big bear of a man, always had a smile on his face. He could be a bit difficult to pin down. Sometimes, when asked what he was up to, he would tell people he did a bit of this and a bit of that, and then he'd usually just laugh. He had worked the doors of the pubs and clubs in the Ashfield area, and had come into contact with a myriad of unsavoury people. Wanting to be his own boss, he had sunk money into a sheet metal business, but found it was not easy to make an honest crust. His friends knew he had become involved with people who were selling Class A drugs in and around Nottinghamshire, and they were heavy hitters, but Drakey kept everything to himself. He never told his friends he was worried about the spot of bother he was in. He thought he could handle any trouble that came himself. 2 major drug gangs were interested in the debt that Drakey owed. The Dawes family, who controlled the supply of drugs across the East Midlands from their base in Sutton and Ashfield, North Nottinghamshire, and the Bestwood cartel. As he steered his Mercedes into the drive, Drakey was still thinking about trying to reconcile his marriage. Though he and his wife had been estranged for 6 months, things were getting better. He knew his daughter, aged 8, and son, aged 11, wanted him to go back home, and he and Andrea had become closer in the recent weeks, thanks to a holiday in Devon and Cornwall and a break in Skegness. He had even told his mum that he reckoned he and Andrea would get back together by Christmas. If only he could get these people off his back, he could start making plans again. Drakey was tired and didn't see 2 men get out of a silver Peugeot 206 across the road. They had been waiting there for more than 2 hours. He didn't hear them walk down his drive. He only saw them as he opened his door, and before he knew it, they were pumping bullets into him. Even with his body riddled with 10 shots, Mr. Draycott managed to crawl to a neighbour's house and raise the alarm. He was wheeled into an ambulance semi-conscious and fought hard to stay alive, but 10 bullets was too much even for Drakey. 4 days later, he was dead at the age of 40. Andrea, who had arrived on the scene of the shooting just after her husband was being carried away, issued an appeal at Christmas. No child's last memory of their father should be of him wheeled into an ambulance riddled with bullets. They have had their childhood taken away. If anybody knows anything, but they are scared to come forward, I would ask them to think about themselves in the same situation. How would they feel if their children had lost a father? I would ask them to be strong, because without their help, David's killers won't be brought to justice. A month after the murder, in the early hours of November the 7th on a Thursday, a man called John Shipman was finding it hard to sleep in his new flat in Chiltern Way in Bestwood. Like David Draycott, he was no stranger to violence. Mr. Shipman was not long out of prison, having severely beaten a man up in his home in the Sherwood area in 1998. Now he lay listening to music in his room, but he was worried. The Bestwood cartel were chasing him over a friend's cannabis debt. His mate had done a runner and left Mr. Shipman to bear the grunt. Although it was only a couple of £100, they meant serious business. He was still nursing the bruises from a beating he had taken outside the Anchor pub in Gunthorpe Village on Guy Fawkes night. They had told him then that he would have to find a way to pay the money very quickly. He had asked friends to help, but they were slow to come through. As Mr. Shipan listened to his music, two men entered his flat and walked in on him. He knew them, two brothers who had worked with Colin and David Gunn, collecting money and selling drugs for them. One had something in his hand. Mr. Shipan pleaded with them, but they refused to hear his explanations. A single shot rang out, and John Shipan lay dead. He was 25 years old. As the two men walked out the block of flat, an associate of Mr. Shipan saw them get into a car and made a mental note of the situation. Later, the same man would tell the police what he had seen, and would be forced to go on the run with his family because the gangsters knew he knew and had threatened to murder him. Though two of Colin Gunn's associates were arrested for John Shipan's murder, the case remains unsolved to this day. Friends of those arrested claim a rogue police officer tipped off the suspects that a bug had been placed in their sofa, throwing the investigation into complete chaos. Like Andrea Draycott, John Shipan's mother, Josie, has still to receive justice for the murder of her loved one. In the summer of 2003, Chief Constable Steve Green found himself in a building that he had never been in before. He had been summoned to a meeting in London to discuss how certain law enforcement agencies could help him in the battle against organised crime. Mr. Green had problems locating the building and had rang his secretary twice to double check the address. He finally found it and he was ushered into a room. Senior managers from the National Crime Squad, National Criminal Intelligence Service, Customs and Excise Investigation Service, and other shadowy figures who worked with government were there to greet him. "We gather you have a problem in Nottingham," he was told. "Well, we are here to help. You have our full support to make use of, and all the resources that we have to offer. This is a problem that must be sorted out before it goes any further." That problem had become so acute that, in March 2003, David Blakey, one of the senior inspectors from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Police, HMIC, refused to give Nottinghamshire Police a clean bill of health. They were, he concluded, neither effective nor efficient. If you lived, worked or visited Nottinghamshire in April of 2002, you were more likely to have a crime committed against you than anywhere else in the country, Mr. Blakey's report stated. He was particularly critical of the abilities of the police force to deal with drugs and crime. Some senior CID officers had also made clear to HMIC that the disbandment of the drug squad and the use of divisions instead had seriously hampered the ability to fight organised crime. There was a widely held view that the forced drugs investigation function was not robust, wrote Mr. Blakey. The main response to drug investigation at all levels remains with divisions who respond within available resources. HMIC was advised during divisional visits that most drug investigation activity took place at local area command level, and that they were unable to respond efficiently to drugs intelligence. Overall, the redeployment of forced drug squad resources had not increased the drug investigations capacity at a divisional level. There was also reference to the pressures that the CID was under. Mr. Green's reorganisation strategy had been forced upon the CID at the most inappropriate moment, coinciding with the explosion of gun crime in 2002. The report stated that some of the failures to meet HMIC targets were due to the wider force reorganisation and unprecedented resource demands for murder investigations. Regardless of any leap in crime which may have put Nottinghamshire under pressure, it was dealing with 21 new murder investigations that year, against an average of 12. This was either a veiled criticism of the abilities of frontline officers to do their jobs, or an indictment of Mr. Green's reorganisation skills. The Labour MP for Nottingham North, Graham Allen, had been critical of Mr. Green as early as 2001, particularly over the issues of beat bobbies being taken away and replaced with officers in cars, and in 2002 he had raised the issue in the House of Commons. "We in the City of Nottingham Division are losing bobbies on the beat," said Mr. Allen. "In addition, our police stations are losing large numbers of officers to response units. In effect, those stations are being hollowed out." Was it right, he asked the Home Secretary, that at the time when the government was being congratulated for employing more police than ever before, people on some estates were seeing fewer of these officers? The Chief Constable, however, had stuck to his guns. "I would challenge anybody to undertake change of this depth and not have a few plates fall off," he said. "It is inevitable the consequence of trying to tackle so much change." At the same time, he admitted, the beat officer issue was a stumbling block that we had tripped up on. Officers were unsure about their role. Now the table of heavyweight officials who confronted Mr. Green were talking about organised crime and the problems caused by gun-wielding gangsters, including the Bestwood cartel. Mr. Green was stunned by the detail that the officials had. As he would later admit, the tackling of gun crime in the NG Triangle had distracted attention from the city's white gangsters. By 2003, it was clear to us that something else was happening, he later told the BBC in an interview. A few months earlier, when approached by his own senior officers about the problem, he had approved an investigation, but had told them they would have limited resources and that their work would be completed within 6 months. Now he was being told by representatives of national agencies that it would have to be a much bigger operation, involving them. Technology only just being field tested by MI5 would be available. National Crime Squad officers would be used for covert surveillance, and part of stage 1 of the operation, a police officer from London would be sent undercover to try and infiltrate the Bestwood cartel. It would be a multi-layered investigation overseen by the clandestine carcass of operatives. Each individual sub-operation against an arm of the Gun Brothers empire would be given the codename of states in the USA, such as Utah and Texas. Less than a handful of officers would know what the overall operation was actually about. Everything would be on a need-to-know basis only. By August 2003, Nottinghamshire's head of CID, Phil Davis, had been given the go-ahead that he had been pleading for over the previous 12 months. Operation Starburst was born. They began with Operation Texas. An undercover police officer was brought up from London to infiltrate one side of the gang. Officers decided that they would target one of the gun's lieutenants, Jamie Neal. The plan was that the officer would pose as a drug smuggler from London who was forced out of the capital and was now lying low in Nottingham. His story was carefully constructed, as it needed to be. Once introductions had been made in Nottingham, Mr. Neal turned up to Mr. Gunn to make inquiries about a bogus villain's background. Associates went down to London to check out his story and found out that it was true. Within a few months, the undercover officer was making significant inroads into the gang and picking up vital intelligence on drugs that were coming in. Then one evening, he was invited to a boxing match. Things were going well until he moved on to a nightclub where Mr. Neal and his associates had booked a VIP area closed off from the public and proceeded to get very drunk. At some point in the evening, One of the gang took offence to something that had been said and launched a ferocious attack on an associate. The undercover officer intervened. He too began taking a beating from Jamie Neal and suffered a fractured skull. The secrecy of Operation Texas meant medics could not be sent to the scene in any other manner than a normal response to prevent suspicion from being aroused within the cartel. Eventually, an ambulance was sent and the officer was taken to hospital, but Operation Texas was now in tatters. Operation Utah was then launched. Bosses decided that it was too dangerous to send in more undercover officers, so results would have to be achieved through total surveillance of the gang, using covert methods including bugs and cameras. Events in the underworld, however, began to move at a breathtaking pace. In the early hours of the 29th of August 2003, after a lock-in at the Sporting Chance on Hucknall Road in the Bulwell area, a group of young men were draining the last dregs of their drinks. The group included Jamie Gunn, Colin and David's nephew, and Marvin Bradshaw, plus 2 other friends. It was 4 AM and they were finally about to go home. They had enjoyed a good evening, even though it had been threatened to turn sour 3 hours earlier when 2 men tried to muscle their way into the pub and had to be forcibly ejected. Jamie knew both the men. They had dealt drugs on the Bestwood estate in the past, and one had been going out with a Bestwood girl, which had caused trouble for one of his Uncle Colin's right-hand men. A scuffle had erupted and Jamie Gunn had smacked one of the men with an ashtray, causing a deep cut to his head. The other man was Michael O'Brien, a renowned hothead. The other, Gary Salmon, told him to cool it and dragged Mr. O'Brien away. Mr. Salmon had an ongoing beef with the Bestwood cartel and was keen not to antagonise any of them. 4 weeks earlier, a white van had parked up in his home in Brooklyn Road. As Mr. Salmon stood in the doorway, a gunman had jumped out the back and fired 3 shots at him. He was a marked man. Jamie Gunn's group began to disperse from the bar and make their way to the car park. Jamie was keen for his pal Marvin to drive the car. He was drunk and didn't want to get pulled over by the police. Marvin, who was sober, agreed and got into the driver's seat of the silver Renault Megane while Jamie was sat in the back. 2 other men occupied the rear and front passenger seats. As Marvin turned the ignition key, the windows were still steamed up, but he began to drive off anyway. Jamie turned and rubbed the glass to clear his window. He saw a shadowy figure wearing a balaclava walking towards the car. There was a loud bang and glass from the driver's side window shattered over the passengers. Everybody in the car ducked down except for Marvin, who groaned but continued to drive the car until the car finally slowed and came to a halt on the grass verge with the engine still running. Jamie Gunn got out. He did not know what was going on. A car carrying 2 men in balaclavas screeched off. Through the shattered window of the driver's door, he could see his friend slumped over on the wheel, groaning. "I feel sick," said Marvin. "I want to feel my head. I want to get out the car." Jamie could see that there was a red hole in Marvin's head and had realised his friend had been shot. He took off his red t-shirt, wrapped it around his best friend's head and lifted him out the car, comforting him. "Just stay here with us, mate, it's gonna be alright." But Marvin Bradshaw was dying there on the desolate car park. Part of Jamie Gunn was dying right there too. He just didn't know it yet. Despite the brutality of Marvin Bradshaw's murder, it was barely reported by the media other than local papers. Outside Nottingham, it was simply another gun death and warranted little more than an odd newspaper paragraph. The police were keen to stress that Marvin was a likeable young man who had never been in trouble with the law. He worked hard as a shop fitter, sometimes 6 days a week, and he was very well liked. Although police initially believed Jamie Gunn was the intended target, another man in the car that night had in fact been in Mr. O'Brien's sights. They were also aware that feelings could be running high. They would have a race against time to catch the people responsible before revenge was sought by the Bestwood cartel. Detective Chief Inspector Phil Walker, leading the investigation, told the media, "We have not had many witnesses at all really so far. There was an after hours drinking session at a pub, and the people who had been in there were a bit reluctant to give us a statement. This was nothing to do with the fear of being caught drinking after hours. Those in the sporting chants that evening had already been told by the Bestwood cartel that this would be sorted out in their own way, not by the police or anyone from Operation Ozone, the name for the investigation into Marvin's murder. Police had the names of Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Salmon, but the Bestwood cartel's tentacles reached deeper and much further than theirs. Within 24 hours, Colin Gunn had put the word out within the criminal fraternity. "We need to find these two before the police. Put the word out to everybody. If you get a bite, you will be rewarded," he told his troops. By the 3rd of September, intelligence was coming in to the police that Mr. Gunn was pulling out all the stops to track down the duo, and that if Mr. O'Brien or Mr. Salomon could not be found, then their relatives would have to be targeted. The cartel's soldiers got to work. On the 7th of September, a brick and then a firebomb were thrown through the window of a house Mr. Salmon had once shared with an ex-girlfriend, Alison Oldham, in Leybourne Drive in Bestwood. On the same day, a homemade grenade was thrown through a window at Mr. Salmon's house on Brooklyn Road. Colin Gunn also learned that 2 associates of Mr. Salmon had helped him get away. On the 8th of September, as one of the two drove a car with a friend, a motorbike with a back passenger pulled up alongside and fired 2 shots into the car, hitting him in the buttocks. Police attributed the shooting directly to the Bestwood cartel. By this time, officers had been visiting Michael O'Brien's mother, Joan Sterland, almost daily as they stepped their efforts up to track down her son. She helped them as much as she could, and said her son had implicated that he had been involved in the murder in a telephone conversation, but she did not feel that she could make a statement. This was also information that the Bestwood cartel had become aware of, almost certainly through a police contact, and it incensed them that she was unwilling to make a statement. The cartel also knew Mrs. Sterland's home address, and were aware that Mr. O'Brien had a sister in Boston in Lincolnshire. The police could not work out how Colin Gunn was getting so much intelligence, yet they now knew that anybody connected with the 2 suspects was in danger. There was a collective sigh of release from the Ozone team when Michael O'Brien was arrested in Leicester on the 9th of September at his girlfriend's house. Mrs. Sterland had been told about the shooting of Kevin White, but not that she or any of her family was in danger, even though there was clear evidence that she was. Mr. Gunn himself believed that a few scare tactics were needed to concentrate Mrs. Sterland's mind about giving the police a statement implicating her son. Late on the evening of the 14th of September, 2 crashed helmet gunmen left their motorcycle and approached her house on Southview Road. They fired 5 times, twice from a .38 revolver and 3 times from a shotgun. 1 bullet went through the first floor bedroom window, another through the bathroom window, a third through the front door, and 2 through the downstairs window. John and Joan Sterland dived onto the living room floor and lay there, paralysed with fear, until Joan was able to crawl upstairs to make a 999 phone call to the police from her mobile phone. They were very lucky to be alive. That same day, the Bestwood cartel again targeted Alison Oldham's home in Leybourne Drive with an arson attack, while another former girlfriend of Mr. Salmon's reported seeing a gunman on a motorcycle pointing a shotgun towards her near her home. The next morning, the Sterlings decided to leave Nottingham for good. They were terrified and had no faith in the police being able to protect them from the gangsters. Indeed, they thought that the presence of the officers in their vicinity was aggravating the situation and making them less secure. They had good reason to feel that way. In late September 2003, a young Scot sat in a pub being lectured by a tall, burly, shaven-head man in a Lacoste tracksuit top. The young man quietly took in the message as the shaven-head man explained his plan to rob the jewellery shop. He had recently lost £70,000 of a cocaine shipment and needed some quick cash to pay off the suppliers. The young man had already carried out several armed robberies for the man in the past few weeks, 3 of them over a single 24-hour period. During one raid, he had discharged a gun he was carrying to frighten the victims that he was robbing. The same day, he had also been part of a gang of men who brutally attacked a dreadlocked social worker, Derek Sr., while he was enjoying a pint with his friend in the Lord Nelson pub in Bulwell. The shaven-headed man knew the Scottish lad was a hothead and sometimes a liability, but he could groom him, he thought. He would try and buy off the Rastafarian social worker with a bribe, but for now he needed this robbery carrying out as soon as possible. 2 other men who were working for the gang had already been in the shop and decided which jewellery cabinet to target. The shaven-headed man stressed that he did not want anybody killed. According to an account later given to the police by one of those involved, and outlined to the judge in a legal submission before the trial, the burly man was Colin Gunn, and the young man was James Brodie, one of his underlings. They were planning the robbery of the Time Centre in Arnold, Nottingham, run by Victor and Marion Bates. The robbery would involve a 4-man team led by Mr. Brodie. In a getaway vehicle would be Dean Betton and the getaway driver Craig Moran. Peter Williams, the youngest member of the gang at just 17, would carry a crowbar and assist Mr. Brodie. A high-powered scanner would help the gang monitor the police radio messages. The robbery was set for the 30th of September. Peter Williams would later tell the police that Mr. Gunn continued to outline the plan, ordering Mr. Brodie to park his scooter up an alleyway and to make sure that there were no customers in the shop when they entered. Mr. Brodie nodded, listening very carefully. Mr. Gunn said Mr. Williams was adamant that he did not want anyone being shot, but Mr. Brodie was a loose cannon. Who knew what he might do? On the morning of the 30th of September, Victor and Marion Bates made their way into Arnold, taking the road from the village of Ravenshead. Victor was 65 and Marion 64. Their jewellery shop had a bit of an early trade, but by 11 AM only a handful of customers had come into the shop. A woman looking for a watch for her husband, a couple who browsed through engagement rings before leaving empty-handed, and another man looking for some special earrings for a girlfriend. The shop was empty when, at about 1:30 PM, 2 young men wearing motorcycle crash helmets with the visors up and rucksacks on their backs burst in. Zamba Bates, Vicky and Marion's 23-year-old daughter, was helping out in the shop and happened to be on the telephone to her husband. She was startled by the noisy entrance of the 2 men storming in. One of them opened his jacket, took out a crowbar and walked towards the glass cabinets, which he tried to jammy open. The other man, slightly older, looked Xanthi in the eye. "This is an armed robbery. Put the fucking phone down now." It seemed unreal, It was like a scene from a movie. Xantha was rooted to the spot, with the phone still in her hand. Marion and Victor heard the shouting from the back of the shop and rushed to the front counter. Marion saw two young men and walked towards her daughter to take charge of the situation. One of the men levelled the gun at Xantha, who had still had the phone in her hand, and it took a couple of steps forward. Marion rushed in front of Xantha. Trying to protect her daughter, she stretched out her arms and instinctively screamed, "No!" There was a roar of gunfire from 3 feet away, and Marion collapsed to the ground. The shooter shouted at Marion, now slumped on the floor, "You stupid cow," as all hell broke loose. Victor managed to press a silent alarm button underneath the counter and now had an old fencing foil which he grabbed from the back of the shop. He rushed towards the gunman, later identified as James Brody. Mr. Brody aimed the gun at him and pulled the trigger, but this time the weapon misfired. Then Xantha jumped on Mr. Brody's back, screaming and grabbing his arm so that he couldn't raise the weapon again at her father. Peter Williams, who had been grabbing jewellery from the cabinet and throwing it into his rucksack, saw his accomplice in trouble and swung his metal bar at Victor, slamming it into the side of his face. Reeling in pain with a fractured cheekbone, Victor remained undaunted and attacked Brody with the foil once again. Mr. Williams raised the iron bar and aimed several more blows at Victor's arms as the shopkeeper tried to stab Mr. Brody. Finally, Mr. Brody threw Xantha off his back, cutting her lip badly, with the handle of his gun in the process. He made for the exit quickly, followed by Mr. Williams. They headed for a nearby alleyway where they had left the scooter with the engine running, but the gunshot and the commotion attracted the attention of several shoppers who were trying to see what was going on. Mr. Brody brandished his gun angrily and screamed, "Get out the fucking way." The startled shoppers parted and the raiders made their escape. At the petrol station, about a mile away, their getaway car is waiting, with Craig Moran driving and Dean Betton in the passenger seat. Mr. Betton's job was to get rid of the scooter while Mr. Moran drove Mr. Brody and Mr. Williams back to a safe house to check their spoils. They found 2 rings, 3 pairs of earrings and a pendant worth just £1,100 in the rucksack. It was the price of Marion Bates' life. The death of Marion Bates again trained the eyes of the nation onto Nottingham. The fears of the white Middle Englander were concentrated into that one brutal murder. The Bates were grandparents, middle class, owned a small business and lived in a village. Chief Constable Steve Green wondered what he had done to deserve such pressures. It was a far cry from the blueprint for success that he had devised and envisioned for Nottinghamshire some 3 years earlier, when he had taken over the force of 2,500 officers and a budget of some £170 million per year. Now it was attracting a reputation for being the worst police county in England and Wales, despite the setting up of a reputation unit costing council taxpayers more than £400,000 per year to tackle the media of the betrayal of the city. By then it was too late. The adverse headlines had sunk into public's consciousness. By the 23rd of September 2003, John and Joan Sterling had moved to a council flat in Goal on the Humberside coast. The place was not a dream home by the seaside that they had hoped for. In fact, it was barely big enough for the 2 of them. They had received some help from the police in getting a tenancy on a 1-bedroom flat, but they felt increasingly isolated. Both were taking sleeping pills and antidepressants, and Joan was suffering from severe depression. Her son had been charged with a brutal murder, and now they were living in a tiny flat in a place they hated, constantly looking over their shoulders. As the months ticked by, the depression got worse. By November 2003, Joan had had enough. She wrote in her diary, "Tuesday, the 2nd of September, 3 police came to our house and said they wanted to speak to my son JJ about a murder. After that, they came every day for over a week. Then he was caught. Then the next Sunday at 10 PM, 2 men on a motorbike came to our house and fired 6 shots. They tried to kill me and John, my husband. The next day, police told us to leave Nottingham. We didn't know where to go, so we just drove. We ended up in Bridlington. We went to the council there, and the manager, Karen Jordan, said, 'Why land on our doorstep? Why Bridlington?' We were in such a state we didn't know what to do or who to turn to. She just told us to come back on Monday, which we did. She took us to a single person's flat in a house with a man living upstairs. We were told to sign a tenancy. We were told we had no choice, so, desperate, we did it. We are on antidepressants plus sleeping pills. The GP, Dr. Moran, wrote us a letter to get us moved on. So did the psychiatrist, but the CID in Nottingham put a stop to it. They said it is too dangerous for us to go back. We have done nothing wrong. We are decent, innocent people. We have worked all our lives, and now we have nothing. We are desperate to get out from where we are. So desperate that, if we are not out by Christmas, you will be taking us out in a box. We just need you to know, we want to be buried in Nottingham, in Wilford Cemetery. This is just because the police in Nottingham can't control the Gunn family, who run the Bestwood estate, and everyone in it. It is disgraceful that the police can't do anything about them. They used me 3 times, and now they don't want to know. Our lives are non-existent. We haven't been out of this bedsit since the day we moved here on September the 22nd in 2003. We are at the end now. All we wanted was to come back home." During a phone call to her daughter Rosie in early November 2003, Joan said she and John had talked about taking an overdose of sleeping pills and ending it all. Rosie tried to cheer her mum up and told her to get to the police and do something. A few days later, Rosie rang her mum back and told her she had looked through a newspaper and seen some adverts for retirement bungalows in the Lincolnshire coast. She gave Joan the phone number, and a few days later got a call back from her mum, who was ecstatic. "Rosie, it's fantastic," she gushed. "The place is in Trusthorpe, right next to the beach, and it's quiet, but there's plenty to do. It's a perfect place for us, and it's out the way. We are going to take it. Everything is going to be alright." On the 11th of December 2003, police officers were watching Colin Gunn. Operation Starburst had made him and his brother David its number 1 target. Colin had driven to Lincolnshire from Bestwood and was at a caravan site on Sutton Road on the way to Trusthorpe. He was having a dispute with one of his crew who had displeased him. The man had fled Bestwood for the East Coast after bodging up a kidnapping for Colin in Calverton village. Instead of taking the man away from the house in Calverton, he gave him a hiding, and the man had been persuaded to let his victim go free for the £200 he had in his pocket. Colin was furious when he found out and demanded that the kidnappers be dealt with using the most severe tactics. One of them had also bodged a previous shooting, almost killing a child. He had been warned at the time that any more failures to carry out Colin's orders would have fatal consequences for him. Colin called John McSally, his favoured enforcer, over to Sutton to brief him on the job. He made it clear he wanted the man dead, with no mistakes or no messy leftovers. Mr. McSally was staying nearby in a caravan owned by Colin's mum while he planned the job. Mr. McSally approached his target but ended up shooting him through the shoulder instead of the head. Shocked and badly injured, the man lived and made his way to safety. Mr. McSally was later arrested for the shooting but walked straight back out the police station without being charged. On the 14th of December, Joan and John Sterland gathered up their small bundle of belongings and made the journey down to the Radio St. Peter's, their new street, a distinctive name derived from its role from the wartime RAF station in Trusthorpe. They were looking forward to life again, a new start, and could put some of the past behind them. Joan thought she would phone the police just to let them know where they were. They had done little for her, but she felt she ought to give them a call in case the guns were up to anything she needed to know about. On the 15th of December, she rang her contact at Nottinghamshire Police to tell him about their move to Trusthorpe. He warned her about the guns' connections with the area, but she was adamant that this was where they were going to start a new life. The officer would later be asked in a courtroom whether police had subsequently examined the security issues surrounding the Sterlands' move to Trusthorpe. I had satisfied myself that they were not vulnerable in that location. Yes, he replied.